Good morning and welcome to our webinar for the first webinar of 2020. It's culturally relevant digital fabrication. It's sort of the second community of practice webinar we've done since the first one was in November. And so this is still a community of practice webinar, but the theme is culturally relevant digital fabrication. Around in the next 5 minutes or so, we'll start with presentations from our panel. I'll do introductions in a second, and then we'll have some Q&A at the end. For those who don't know, this is the Fab Foundation SCOPESDF team. I'm Natrice Gaskins. Dan Smithwick is handling logistics. Melvin LaPrade is also on board, and maybe Sonia will join us as well soon. But we are the team working on SCOPES. The webinar speakers include, I'll be speaking a little bit as an introduction, Matt Ziegler, Kim Stanley, and then is that Lauren Ainsley or Ainsley?
Ainsley, yeah.
Ainsley is going to also speak about her lesson plan. And so the theme, because it's February, is Black History Month, but more general, culturally relevant making or culturally relevant digital fabrication is the focus for this webinar. So one of the things I was thinking about and we thought about last year, specifically around Marvel's Black Panther film, we were thinking about Black History Month because that's when the film was released in 2018. If you don't know, for those who are in attendance don't know, in 1926, February 1926, Carter G. Woodson launched the celebration of what was known then as Negro History Week. And it was the precursor of Black History Month, which is also the inspiration for this webinar. SCOPES team member Melvin LaPrade wrote a blog post about his participation in the development of SCOPESDF lessons that can be used during Black History Month. You can see the link there. It's also, when you go to the SCOPES website, there is an area where you can actually get access to the blog, or that's the link here, where you can learn about culturally responsive pedagogy, and constructionism. And that was kind of the beginning as far as SCOPES sort of going in that direction. And now we've done more work since then. There's a lot of terminology and concepts around, and they're all they're slightly different. There's culturally responsive pedagogy, and there's culturally relevant pedagogy, and then culturally sustaining pedagogy. So I wanted to show this graphic so you can kind of see what those terms mean. So for culturally responsive pedagogy, there's curriculum modifications to make it more culturally responsive. There's also appreciation of cultural otherness or sort of inclusion of different cultures and at that level. And then on the culturally relevant side, you add on social justice learning and action. So you can see in this graphic, it's additional to what we have on the far left. And then culturally sustaining pedagogy, it calls for schools to be sites for sustaining rather than eradicating the cultural ways of being of communities of color. So these are kind of three different areas that sort of linked, but are coming from different points of view or have different areas of study. This is a graphic. You can, I'll put it in chat, but you can find this PDF online. This is culturally relevant maker learning. It comes from an article, Making Through the Lens of Culture and Power Towards Transformative Visions for Educational Equity, published a couple of years ago, or actually 4 years ago. The three things I want to point to here is there are three columns, and one is looking outward, where you're building on the unique context of your local community. So you're also looking inward, where you're examining areas where habits of maker learning may already be present. And then you look forward, so you're envisioning characteristics of equitable making. So there's these kind of three areas from that paper that's inspired by that paper. There's some questions in there. I won't go through all of them, but in looking outward, who in local community designs, creates, or fixes things as part of their profession, their hobby, or their cultural tradition. So looking outward in the community to find examples of making, which are not necessarily labeled as making, is important because the students that you're working with may actually come from those communities and will be more familiar with them, and showing how that is a way to bridge the gap that may be there with many students who are historically or traditionally excluded. And looking inward is, how is creativity a part of everyday life for students in the school or your classroom? And looking inward, there may be habits of maker learning that's already present, where students are already involved either in clubs or other types of groups or other types of activities where they're doing things that can be considered as making. And then looking forward is what indicators will let you know when students feel a sense of belonging, ownership. So as opposed to saying, here's something that we think is cool, and you should think it's cool because we think it's cool, may not necessarily be the trick. It's how you will see when they're looking at it separate from a distance, as opposed to they're engaged and motivated and moving forward in terms of how they can see themselves and doing this type of work. So these are kind of what makes up a program for culturally relevant maker learning. Towards that, this is a kind of bringing it into what I've been contributing to the SCOPES website, are some culturally relevant making types of lesson plans that focus on, they focus on culture, they focus on computational thinking or computational action, and digital fabrication. I'm going to show some examples of that. Let me just switch over. So on the website, under my name, you can find these lessons. This one's timely because Mardi Gras is coming up. So I'll click on that one. In 2016, I taught AP Computer Science in a high school for the arts and performing and visual arts. So all of my high school students who were enrolled in AP Computer Science all major in the arts. So it was music. I don't think we had any dancers, but we had visual arts, music, and theater maybe. And in addition to that, majority of the class was African-American, Latino, and girls, which is also for AP, which is Advanced Placement and College Board, kind of, what they were aiming for in terms of reaching out to bring those groups to computer science. So in terms of doing that, I made a lot of the content either relevant to them as artists or relevant to them as in their cultures. So this is where a lot of this came from initially, to do this lesson plan. Mardi Gras, because I started to see a connection. So talking about terms in computer science or computational thinking, such as algorithms, decomposition, pattern recognition, abstraction, and tying those things into cultural artifacts is kind of what I was doing then, and also in my research as a PhD student, and also as a teacher. So this lesson plan is an approach to doing that. And then how I brought computation in directly is through Tinkercad code blocks. And Tinkercad is what people use to create 3D models, but Autodesk has also created a Tinkercad code blocks, which allows you to be able to use block-based visual programming to create objects that can be 3D printed or digitally fabricated. So for this lesson, in addition to, there's a whole slideshow on algorithmic and computational thinking to sort of become more familiar with those terms. And then there is looking at the particular, this case, Black masking Indian community in New Orleans, and then some examples of how they sort of build their costumes and the kind of patches and things that they put together in these elaborate costumes, and what it means, what these costumes mean and its importance in the community, and then going right into the workspace in Autodesk and trying to create a patch using code blocks, which you can see here, where they're on the left, you see the coding, the computer programming and scripting, and on the right part of the window, this is what's being made from the code. So learning both computer programming and learning how to do 3D modeling at the same time, which is also something that's very new in this space. And then at the end of that, so, what are these kind of things like variables and operators and stuff you would need to know in computer science, and then STLs, what you need to know for 3D printing, and then the actual work brought into Tinkercad 3D, and then the final project, which is to produce this sort of symbol or patch that you can see here that came from that activity. So this is one example. It's culturally relevant, it fits the criteria. And, you know, I know that the New Orleans Fab Lab has their own version of this where they're using a different software program to explore math in the same community. So that's, you know, sort of and I have a couple other examples to look at in addition to that one. But the goal there is to sort of introduce and bring in those elements together and sort of show how they interconnect or weave together. If you have any questions, we're going to wait to the Q&A portion at the end of this webinar, but you feel free to use the chat. You can also put them in the chat. There's a question option, a Q&A option that you can put there too. And then we'll go through those things when we get to that part of the presentation. So I'm going to move over and stop sharing and move over to Matt, who has some talk about his lesson plan and his work, which is Black History Month focused.
Matt Ziegler. I work at the Bullis School outside of Washington, D.C. My job is officially called the Bit Lab Coordinator. The Bit Lab is the name for the Bullis Innovation Technology Lab. And most of my work is, I do teach some making classes, but most of my work is really coordinating with content area teachers to help them come into the space and add some kind of making hands-on project to whatever it is that they're studying in class. So I liken myself more to a librarian than a teacher in a lot of ways. And the goal is to make sure that every student in the school, whether they sign up for a STEM class, a making class, robotics, engineering, gets an opportunity to come in and use the tools, see how they work, and apply it to hopefully some content area that they're interested in. So we get a lot of artists, a lot of foreign language, English, every different discipline that's out there. But the project that I've been doing now for the last 3 years, and we're actually right in it now with this year's African American history class, is what I was going to show in the lesson plan that's on the website. So I'll share my screen here. And it's a collaboration with Allison Ewing, who is one of our history teachers, and she started the African American Studies seminar class and came to me with 2 project ideas. And the first one, to get the kids experience in using some of the digital fabrication tools and the makerspace, was basically to create an artifact. This was for their first unit of study in the class about African cultures, and was to create an artifact based on their research into an ancient African civilization and their art forms and styles of making, and to recreate those with 21st century technology. So we had a lot of 3D printing, laser cutting, did some CNC machine stuff, and then they present them as a small museum. And so they had to design a logo for their museum. They had to create the plaques that were laser engraved, and then we present those in one of the display areas at the school. And then they come back, and when they're studying the Reconstruction Era, and this is the project that they spend 3 to 4 weeks in the makerspace, working, coming up with ideas, breaking projects apart. And my job is basically as facilitator. So I want them, you know, as much as they can get into the actual design and creation of the parts, but I want to make sure that they're able to focus on the content and be able to get that content into whatever it is that they're making. So the first year that we did this project, it was interesting. The goal is to get them all working on a single idea, and so that they can all be pulling in the same direction. And the comment was made as we were sort of brainstorming. They had been studying stories about, you know, the first Black congressman or the Civil War, Black soldiers in the Civil War, things like that, that they saw. One of the students described them as like hidden gems. And they said, well, why don't we make jewelry boxes? And so they came up with this idea of a sort of jewelry box design. And they even went further than that and said, you know, on the front of the jewelry box, it should be the sort of predominant attitude that kept these stories from being told. And when you open the box, you can then see the story. And so this is the final design. Basically, my job was to sort of take their ideas and try to figure out a design that they could apply and have as much ownership of their particular design as possible. And so the first version of this was funny that, you know, I had a very elaborate cover to show them, you know, you could do it like this is how you might make this image. And they were like, no, that doesn't look good at all. We just want a single word. It has to be very clear, very simple, and it has to be in quotes. That was part of their design. And so when you open it up, then that is the sort of creative, the diorama that is inside there. And that is based on some, you know, laser cut imagery, some 3D printed images that they had designed in order to create whatever display they wanted to do. So this was Booker T. Washington. And basically, we try to use as many simple design tools as possible so that they can get their ideas out there. I can understand what it is that they want, but they're still getting a sense of how they work. So for this project, they used a lot of Google Drawings. I put the template as an SVG into Google Drawings, and then they were able to just sort of place images, their text, the words into that template as they could, and so that they could give me a sense of what the designs were, what the objects that they wanted printed were, and then they came in and assembled those boxes once all their parts had been fabricated. The second year that we did the project, the students went off in a very different direction. They were very interested in the life of the average African American during Reconstruction and how hard that was. And so they ended up creating a game, and it's a game that essentially you can't really be successful at. You win the game by being less unsuccessful than other people. So it's extremely hard to have good things happen to you, which of course was the point of the game. And so again, you know, leading them through a series of prototypes. The game board was just written on cardboard and then printed on a sheet of paper. And then eventually we sort of printed it and on a folding piece of board here. And they took this and they actually worked with the 8th grade students who were also studying Reconstruction. And those students used that as sort of a learning tool in their units. We had these cards that they designed and printed. So they had, you know, positive things that could happen, negative things that could happen, that kind of stuff. And so each card has a little bit of information about that particular issue during Reconstruction. And this year we're doing this project again, and we have 2 sections of the class now. So just this last block, some students are building a staircase. And so on the fronts of the staircase are the negative things that had to be overcome. And on the stair treads are the ways in which those were overcome. So the different amendments and the HBCUs are what they identified as the top of the stair. So it's a continually evolving project, and every year the students, they decide what it's going to be within you know, their certain expectations, but they even get to design their own rubric at the end based on what they think are the critical aspects of their project. So it's pretty immersive. It's a lot of work, but every year it's really interesting to see what the kids come up with.
Thank you, Matt. Again, if you have questions, there's a Q&A button at the bottom of your window. You can also put it in the chat, and we'll address those at the end after everyone is presented. The next person I'm going to have go is Kim Stanley. Then Ainsley will come through, and then we will do Q&A. So I'm actually going to pull up, Kim, your lesson plan, because it actually has images in it. You can let me know when you want me to do that now, or do you want me to?
Yeah, that's fine. That'd be great.
Okay, I'll do it as you talk.
Okay. So good morning. My name is Kim Stanley. Like Natrice said, I am the lead teacher here in Chattanooga at the STEM school. I teach English 11 and 12. And last year, working with the Fab Foundation, I had created this lesson using Brian Stevenson's book, Just Mercy, and tying it in with Black Panther. And the idea was for the students to basically shine the light on injustice. And this year, I was able to actually do the lesson. I didn't realize how expensive equipment was, so I was able to get a grant and actually get the materials I needed. And fortuitously for us, the movie was coming out, so the timing was perfect for us to do this lesson. Only a 3-week lesson. I would love to expand it in the future, but basically the students were, it was a 2-part lesson. They had an essay, and then the lampshade was was to tie in with the topic of their essay. So as they read the book, they had to focus on an injustice that spoke to them that Brian Stevenson touches on in the book, and there are many, and racial inequality and numbers in prison. You know, his line, wealth is not the opposite of poverty, justice is, really hit home with my students. We used the laser cutter primarily. We had, what they did was we used propylene for the shade itself, and they were able to, we learned rather quickly that they didn't have to necessarily cut out using the shade. They could put things on the inside for it to shine through. You can see there are some of the examples. They really enjoyed this project, and it went in all different directions, focusing on, and you can see they made the shade completely using, you know, I went with a simple design with the ring, the top ring and the bottom ring, and then, you know, making their designs from that. But they really focused and honed in on a lot of startling facts about our justice system, and really opened their eyes to the inequalities and how broken our system is in so many ways. And it just, it was very empowering for them. It turned out better than I thought. And again, this was my first time actually putting out this unit. 3 weeks was tough for them to get it done. I can see this being expanded. I'd like to bring another culture piece into it, which is what I wanted originally, but with the time constraints, you know, I had to, you know, just really focus on the book aspect. And so there's room for improvement with this unit. However, it was a success. It truly was. It just needs some tweaking. So I don't. Everything is there that's on the website. You can see there one of my students got very creative and wanted the lampshade to represent like a shower curtain. And then the fear, you know, they're in prison, and mental illness came up, was another strong topic that some of the students really focused on, and children being sentenced, and just the disparity racially, the numbers that are in prison. And I was just impressed with how deep they went into their research, and you know, what they were able to find, and it really changed a lot of their opinions on the justice system. You know, what they thought, you know, was the way to go is not the way to go, you know, in the way our laws are right now. So they really enjoyed it. I enjoyed it, got a lot out of it. And like I said, I definitely want to expand. We use the laser cutter. I would like to bring some more from the Fab Lab into this. I'm just not sure yet what direction that will take me.
Well, thank you. I'll stop sharing, and we'll have Ainsley present. Do you want me to pull up anything, Ainsley? I have your lesson plan, but you can also share.
I have the same one pulled up, but I'll use the website also.
Okay.
Hey, Nadris,
Yes.
I think Sonia was raising her hand in the chat window. Sonia, are you there? Do you want to say hello?
She's probably not a panelist. She can only speak if you're a panelist. Okay. Well, we should probably let Ainsley go, and then we can after. So Ainsley, keep going.
Okay, so my name's Ainsley Buckner, and I am the prototyping manager here at Case Western Reserve University's Innovation Center. So something unique about our Innovation Center for a university is that we're open access. So any community member can come and use our space. So Sonia and Melvin kind of collaborated with me. I don't actually remember what year it was. It was right when Black Panther was released. And we put together this activity to engage kind of some local community members. And originally we were making this more targeted towards a high school audience. But then due to kind of more what the need of what students were available in the community, we ended up kind of creating a lesson that could be scaffold depending on which students could come to our activity. So this is listed as K through 12, but that's because it can kind of be taken deeper with older children, or you can kind of change it depending on what audience you're looking in. So for this lesson, the students, we did it kind of as I believe it was like a 9 to 3 type of day. So it's kind of we did it in a 1-day session versus like a multiple session, but it could be broken down. So we ended up, for our first launch of it, we had students that were more through the maybe kindergarten to 6th grade age range. So we had a lot of younger students, but it was really easy to get their buy-in because it was, culturally relevant to Black, and they all loved Black Panther, and they all seemed to be super excited. So for this lesson, it's making a pride piece. So the idea is to make kind of a pride necklace. And within the activity, there's a lot of different things being explored. So you see here, this is kind of an example of what one of the necklaces would look like. So we tried to use a bunch of different technologies, but also mainly we're focused on exploring identity. So through the activity, we started with the students making kind of this emblem that you see out of wood. And so for the emblem, before they made it, Sonia and Melvin kind of helped lead this activity where the students looked at their identity. So first they were relating to the movie and what social identities they saw from the film, and then how they related to those, to then also kind of be aware of how they identify, and then thinking about what a future for identity could look like, kind of based in the movie, thinking about how, there's like, what would a utopia look like? So those were some kind of different avenues for them to explore identity. And then we also had sheets for the students that had Adinkra visual symbols that they could look at, and then based off their identity exercise and then learning about the Adinkra symbols, they created their own emblem based on those 2 activities. Once they drew them, we scanned them in, and then they were laser cut. And then in addition to that, the students also learned a little bit of 3D modeling. So if we go back to this picture, you'll see that there's these beads. So we talked about the symbolism of color and what color could represent. And then we did some 3D modeling. So depending on the age range, we try to include a little bit of math into this. So even though we knew exactly kind of what size the cylinder needed to be and how to make it and figure out the volume, we asked those questions of the students as they modeled it to kind of get them thinking. So a lot of time in the lessons I create, often there's things as a teacher and educator that you pre-calculate because you need to be prepared for the class. but then I try to use that as for if I didn't know, and asking them to kind of solve some of those issues to kind of include some math components to the project. Oh, what I did not mention is in the emblem, we got some little purple LED lights. So we also did a little activity based on circuits. And once again, this kind of depends on age group. With the younger kids, it's more just, we kind of focus on polarity and positive and negative and completing a circuit. But with older kids, you can go a little deeper and kind of make a more crazy circuit. But we were doing this with younger children. So we kind of did a simple battery watch with an LED light. And then we also used our abrasive water jet cutter where the students got to see the water jet cutter kind of cut out the different teeth symbols. And then they each got to stamp their names into the teeth with just a metal stamp and a hammer. So that was pretty much the activity. After we did it for the first time, I did use this with a few other groups. So there's a local community center that brought their teenagers over, and they also seemed to enjoy it. And I think the nice thing, like I said, is kind of the flexibility within the lesson to either bring it to a deeper level for older kids or scale it back to be appropriate for younger children as well. And you can see one of the students holding up his necklace. I think that's everything.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
We do have some questions in the chat. I don't know if we have anything in the Q&A. I know that Sonia Pryor-Jones wants to speak. I don't know if she wants to speak now or after the Q&A, but I'll leave the option there. Dan,
Yeah.
Is there anything in the Q&A or is it just in chat?
On the chat.
Okay, feel free to put questions in either place and Dan can let us know. So at some point, Sonia will come through and I know there's something she wants to add to the topic or to what we're talking about. One of the questions I can see is regarding the context, the educational context. The lesson plan that I showed, the Mardi Gras, actually has information that I used when I taught AP Computer Science. But when I taught AP Computer Science, I was director of a STEAM lab. So the STEAM lab was within the high school and the students were all in it's a morning class, it was during the day of their school day. So they were there 4 days a week, an hour or so each day out of the 5 days and for an entire year. So 16 students, 4 days a week for an entire year in a lab with a laser cutter and 3D printers and electronics and so on. So that was the parts of that around computational thinking, around algorithms, algorithmic design, that comes from the AP Computer Science lessons or sort of that information. And then there's the digital fabrication and the cultural piece just comes because that's my general research. But you could also do that lesson plan in just a lab in a community. So it's both something you can do in a school context, but the school context was in a lab. I don't know portions of what Kim was talking about was done in the Fab Lab and also done in the classroom. Matt, I don't know what how much time was spent in the lab versus a classroom, but I know you collaborate with a teacher on your lesson.
Yeah, it's probably about 50-50.
Okay.
I would say most of mine was done in the classroom using the vinyl cutter. That was on their own time. You know, that's part of the tenets here at STEM is time management. So it's, you know, it's put into the pacing guide to where they know they have to, at some point, you know, get into the Fab Lab and use the laser cutter at this point for this project. And then have it, you know, have what they did in class to finish out their shade. But as far as making the shade itself was done in the classroom.
And Ainsley, was it all in the lab in your case?
Yeah, it was a one-day event where they, all in the lab. And I wasn't collaborating with teachers. These are more community groups. So there wasn't a teacher giving them prior content.
One thing that I did forget to mention, I've talked with Zach McCoy. He's our tech guru here, and for the future, we'd like to add a coding piece for an advanced using Arduino and making the lampshade spin, and adding that component to it. Again, we didn't get to that piece. I would probably have to extend a little bit more time for that.
What else, Dan, we have?
Another question, this is for all the panelists, is what is your opinion of using completely open projects versus projects with a theme or a closed procedure?
I think that depends on your situation. So, I mean, time, age, how many students. I think open projects are always ideal. But I think, you have to gauge what are your resources and time and ability, because open-ended projects take a lot from the instructor to be able to really check in with each student and kind of guide them through their process. But I think even if you have a theme or a closed procedure, there should always be room for agency and kind of a student to have options. It shouldn't be kind of a kit that everyone comes out looking the same. You always want to give some form of agency to the kids to make decisions and kind of express themselves, whether it's about the topic they're learning or some form of self-expression or agency within the choices in the project.
Yeah, I would say, and for the African American Studies class, that's part of the reason why we did 2 projects. The first one was a little bit more prescribed, though they had choice as to what their final product would look like, but they were given the rubric ahead of time. They were given the expectations ahead of time about, the culture that they had studied and what aspects of that culture should be included in their final product. But that gave them some access and understanding of what was possible in the makerspace. A lot of those kids had never been in to the lab before, so they worked in small groups and they all used different technologies. So at the end of that, they'd seen what a laser cutter could do, what a 3D printer could do, what the CNC machine could do, or the sewing machine, whatever. So then when they came back, they had that vision for their more open projects. Normally, like I said, we try to get them to do one group effort, which helps me in the facilitating. There may be more parts, but the parts are related. This year, we actually had one of the sections, they could not reach a consensus on a project. So we have 3 projects going on in that class, and that does definitely modify the scale of what they can do, just because there's not as much, I don't have the time to build 3 grand projects. So, but at least it was 3 projects and not 18. So that, that's a bit of a balancing act, but yeah, I think they all have their place. Sometimes I have teachers that come in and say, I need this object. I need my students to make this object. And that's great. And sometimes they say, we're studying this and I have no idea what a project would be. What do you got? And that's great as well. But it's definitely more determined, I think, by what's being studied.
And then for the computational thinking, digital fabrication combined, College Board, for those who are not in the United States, they're the ones that administer an exam and materials for the advanced placement computer science and other subjects. You have to submit a syllabus to be approved by College Board prior to running the course. I actually did not, it was not my plan to teach AP computer science, but I was convinced to write a syllabus and submit it. So I knew that I'm working with students who are girls and who are African American, Latino primarily. And I also knew that they're all art majors. And I said, there's no way that juniors and seniors in high school and at this point will be interested if they're not already in computer science unless I made it art-based. So I submitted an art-based syllabus focused on computer science to College Board, which was approved. And since that was my agreement, I realized I had to teach this class. In addition to that, all along from the very beginning, every time they learned coding, they were learning with a culturally relevant component. From looking at Sojourner Truth, Ain't I Woman, and learning how to write that as a conditional statement, to you know, the algorithm stuff with the quilts, African American and indigenous quilts, European quilts. We were looking at cultural artifacts and looking at computation at the same time. So that was something that we would hope. This is an elective course, so students, if they were not interested, could easily drop this course. To my surprise, nobody dropped the class, and there was a waiting list. It didn't, you know, one of the things that was important is that at some point these students are working on projects towards getting the credit for AP computer science, but also towards learning the concepts they need to know to take the exam. But within that framework, it was also open to how they would do data analysis and information. Music students were actually composing instead of doing pie charts and bar charts, composing to the data that they were learning, gathering and collecting. So they were being very creative with the content, and that was allowed because they wanted to make sure the students were engaged and not going to drop this class or drop the subject. So really the importance of the culturally relevant pedagogy is how to engage students who normally would not be engaged in digital fabrication or engaged in coding in ways that they feel like they're represented. Are there any questions in the chat, other than in the chat, Dan?
There are.
Okay.
We can keep moving along here. So first one is, can we talk about the role of collaborative learning, or PBL, with digital fabrication classroom activities?
So I know that you have, Kim, you can speak to the PBL component because it's used a lot in STEM chat, and then others can too.
I'll start with our 9th and 10th graders primarily with their PBLs. They're all core based. And one of our biggest units for them is with the Hunter Museum. So they're put into groups of 3 or 4. And they are taken to the Hunter Museum here in Chattanooga, and then they recreate an art piece that they choose that is on display at the museum. And you know, there's an English portion to that PBL. It all ties with all their core subjects, of course, with art. And you know, they do that in 9th and 10th grade with different partnerships that we have. And then in 11th grade, again, they're put into every quarter, they're put into different teams, and we have roughly 9 business partners each quarter that they work with. And basically now it's not, you know, they're being told what to do. The business partner is coming to them and saying, here's our problem. Can you, you know, come up with a solution? And we've had some amazing work with the groups collaboratively, you know, all working together to solve the problem for our business partner. And then in 12th grade, we take it one step further. And again, they are put into groups, but this time they have to come up with the problem and come up with a solution. So it's kind of like Shark Tank for seniors. And so the goal here at STEM is from 9th grade, you know, starting out with that collaborative PBL learning and taking all the way through to their senior year, and all the different phases that they go through, from being told specifically with very tight parameters to a little bit looser, to, you know, business partners giving them the problem and then coming up with the problem, and then of course using digital fabrication in our Fab Lab to create their solutions and come up with their solutions. Individually in the classroom, I've done it a couple times with projects. I've done a symbolism project using Lord of the Flies and Animal Farm, and together they had to create a symbol that represented both stories, and for an app company that wanted to increase reading, and so they had to come up with a symbol that they could use, and it would represent those 2 classic stories. And so you know, it's done. It can be done well. Contracts are important. If you go that route, anybody else can jump in if they want to talk on that.
I know mine was not technically in classroom, but prior to working at ThinkBox, I did arts integration into Cleveland Public Schools. And so I think it's similar to what Kim's saying, like when Melvin and I even made this lesson plan, we made sure that every single component tied into the core in Ohio, the scope and sequence. Mm-hmm. So it's completely relevant. So it's really about how do the projects you do enhance their understanding of the topic, and really making sure that they're gaining knowledge of whatever core curriculum you're following through these hands-on activities. And then another component that I would say when you talk about collaboration is in all of the lessons, even in our lesson plan, there's a lot of room for kind of essential questions and reflection, and a lot of group feedback. So sharing what you made, why did you make it, and kind of teaching students to be able to talk about the work, but also hear feedback about their work and have questions. So I would say that even if they're individually making a necklace, they're learning that collaborative skill of talking to each other and exploring ideas. And even in a lot of these activities, when we run them, we let the students help each other. So maybe one student's having trouble. It's not very like, oh, stay at your desk. Only you can make this. A lot of time, there's one student who really understands the CAD who's helping the student next to them. Mm-hmm. So I would say that most maker kind of lesson plans end up being pretty collaborative.
Mm-hmm.
Great. I feel like we just answered a couple of the other questions in the Q&A, which are about scope and sequence, and also directly to you, Ainsley, about how do you kind of organize people when they come in? How do they sign up? Do they all have to be on the same page? I feel like you kind of addressed that in your talk there. The next question up would be how would you suggest keeping pace? Oh, that was done. Sorry, done. From Antonio. Hey, Antonio. This type of activity is for all students, or do they fit better with some type of students? If yes, can you define what type?
Is he one of our projects specifically, or?
I think just well, either
well,
one.
Culture. We're talking about culturally relevant digital fabrication. So I think that's what it's, that type.
All students.
I mean, in particular, I know ours was going from using a very culturally relevant Black Panther, right? Like every kid is watching Black Panther, and it's a part of every student's world. So I think, yeah, it's kind of everyone.
We have one more here. Given that a majority of teachers are white and increasingly in school classrooms, I don't quite understand this question. Increasingly school classrooms are majority students of color. Can each speak of how this impacts their teaching?
Oh, you're dealing with culturally relevant themes, and the classrooms are becoming majority of color. Increasingly, I guess that's the question. How does that impact teaching?
I mean, I'm not a teacher, but from coming into schools and when we have students here, I think it's about putting yourself aside, no matter who your demographic is, whether it's predominantly Black students or Latino, it doesn't matter. It's about trying to understand your students' perspective. So I think no matter what you are, you need to be able to listen to your students, understand your students, and help identify with them and be part of their community and culture, versus just a teacher who, you know, you're there for the day and you separate yourself from your students. It's kind of, no matter what the population is, really trying to listen and understand where your students are coming from. But I'll let the teachers talk.
For me, with this project, you know, I'm kind of twice separated from it, because not only am I not African American, but I'm not even the history teacher. And, you know, I've learned more about Reconstruction over the last 3 years than I ever did when I was in high school. and I'm learning about it from the student's own perspective, because this project gives them an opportunity to say, you know, I've learned these facts, I've read these, you know, accounts of what life was like. And as a young African-American, there are, you know, it's probably 95% African-American students in these classes. This is what matters to me about what I'm hearing. And they're able to build that into whatever object they're making. And so, like I said, the first iteration, they were very much focused on the sort of heroic stories that came out of that time, with a recognition of the greater negative situation. And then the second year, it was almost entirely looking at, this is what, you know, this is how hard life was for almost everybody. And so my job, I feel like, is to just facilitate as best as I can, to try to listen to them and to try to understand what it is that they want to say about this. And it's very much like more of a sort of creative writing type of assignment, where it's their voice, as long as they are, you know, basing some things on the research that they've learned about the time period, that they have a good grasp of what actually, you know, factually we can say about that time period, that it's up to them how they want to present that. So that's been really, really cool for me to learn about it again from a completely different viewpoint. So that's why it's always interesting. Every year, they're going to see it in a different way. Every object has been different so far.
Yeah, and just to piggyback off of Ainsley as well, I do believe it's knowing your students, meeting them where they're at and giving them their voice, you know, to express themselves, whether it be in a project, you know, using DigFab, whether it's a written assignment, whatever it is. There are so many ways, and it doesn't have to just be, you know, during a certain period of time. You know, I try and do things throughout the whole year that is giving, you know, my students an opportunity to find their voice and express themselves in a variety of ways. You know, no matter what we're reading or talking about at that time.
So in 2015, I found myself in China teaching 10th graders how to build robots based on this concept called tensegrity, which is from Buckminster Fuller, using skewers and rubber tubing. And they were 10th graders. What I noticed, they reminded me of 10th graders at the high school that I was coming from. I know that there was a language issue. We had a translator, but they actually got to examine the structure before they actually showed up. And then we did this workshop on stage in front of 400 teachers for a 35-minute lesson. So I had to deliver this lesson to students I had just met in a different country with a language issue, with a translator. And I was able to do that. At the end, the students were able to stand up and show the teachers what they had made and talk about it. One of the things the teachers wanted to know from me is what I wanted to see when I was in Xi'an. And I said, well, my whole thing is cultural heritage, so throw everything at me. So the teachers actually took me to Taoist temples. They took me to different museums when I wasn't at the school. And it became kind of a sharing or a fact-finding mission to sort of figure out ways to connect what I was learning and what was new to me to what I was actually doing with students at the school in China. I think that applies across the board. Is you do sort of the work, you meet them where they're at, and you also figure out how these different subject areas connect, and you help them connect it, and then they can take it the rest of the way. So I don't think there are any more questions, Dan. I know that Sonia wanted to say something. We have about 5 minutes left. I'm going to put up a slide and put it on the chat, the survey link. But Sonia, if you're hearing us now, please feel free to come on. And and if anyone else wants to ask any questions, feel free.
Hi, this is Sonia. I can hear you guys. What a wonderful session that we had this morning. And I was waiting for the question as it relates to the demographic of teachers versus the demographics of the growing public school population. And was really done well. I am curious to know if any of the panelists have had any additional professional development in their schools or in their career that has also positioned them to address student interests and student culture, as well as they're doing it in this work. Because I think if you've had some of those experiences and can share those resources with others, that would be really helpful. But I do want to, make the comment that I think the notion of culturally relevant pedagogy will only continue to grow when we're talking about teaching and learning, as our kids become more and more adept to engaging with people all over the world. And as our students also have an opportunity through technology to extend the reach in terms of the types of culture and people that they are engaged with. So I think it's a really important topic as it relates to race, but also other ways in which we self-identify. I would encourage people to take a look at the SCOPES playbook that is on our website, where we dug into some of this a little bit with people like Kim and others during the leadership cohort. And so that may even be something we could drop the link in our materials. But I just wanted to say thank you to everyone for a really rich conversation today.